5 years after his marriage collapsed, Daniel Carter had become comfortable with a life that was much quieter than the one he once imagined. He no longer woke up expecting to hear Rebecca moving around the kitchen. He no longer kept his phone beside him waiting for a message from her. He had learned how to walk past memories without stopping. He had learned that healing did not mean forgetting. It simply meant that the memories no longer controlled every decision you made. But on an ordinary evening, 5 years after the divorce, Daniel was about to discover that some chapters do not end when you close the book. Sometimes they remain unfinished, waiting for someone to return and tell you the part of the story you were never allowed to hear. That evening, Daniel was sitting alone when 3 knocks came from his front door. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, he saw Rebecca, her mother Linda, and her brother Mark standing outside. None of them smiled. None of them moved. Then Linda looked directly at him and said, "Daniel, we're not here to argue." She paused. "We're here because we were wrong." Daniel stared at them. 5 years earlier, those same people had told him to stay away from Rebecca. Now they had come back to his door. And Daniel knew that whatever had happened during those 5 silent years had changed everything. To understand why they had returned, we have to go back to the marriage before it fell apart. Daniel and Rebecca had not begun as enemies. They had begun as 2 people who genuinely believed they had found the person they could build a life with. They met through mutual friends and slowly became inseparable. Daniel admired Rebecca's warmth and the way she made people feel comfortable around her. Rebecca admired Daniel's determination. He wasn't wealthy, and he didn't pretend to be. But he worked hard and believed that a man's worth was measured by what he was willing to do for the people he loved. When they eventually married, their life was ordinary. They had bills, responsibilities, disagreements, and dreams they were still trying to reach. But they also had laughter, family dinners, holidays, and the quiet routines that slowly turned 2 people into a family. Rebecca's mother, Linda, welcomed Daniel warmly. Her brother Mark treated him like another member of the family. For years, Daniel believed he had gained more than a wife. He believed he had gained another family. He had no idea that one day those same people would stand together and decide that he was the reason Rebecca was unhappy. The trouble began when Daniel's work became unstable. The financial pressure was gradual at first. One missed opportunity became another. Savings began disappearing faster than expected. Daniel tried to shield Rebecca from the worst of it because he believed he could fix the situation before she became frightened. But Rebecca eventually discovered that their financial position was worse than she had realized. She felt betrayed. Daniel felt misunderstood. Their arguments became more frequent. The problem was not simply money anymore. It was what money represented. Rebecca began wondering whether Daniel was making responsible decisions. Daniel began feeling that no matter what he did, Rebecca saw failure instead of effort. They were both becoming frightened, but they expressed that fear differently. Rebecca talked. Daniel withdrew. Rebecca interpreted his silence as indifference. Daniel interpreted her questions as accusations. And every argument left another small crack in the marriage. Rebecca began telling Linda about the problems at home. At first, the conversations were normal. A daughter was upset, and a mother listened. But gradually, Linda became convinced that something was seriously wrong. Rebecca told her about the arguments. She told her about Daniel's financial decisions. She told her how lonely she felt. She told her how often she cried after they fought. All of those things were real. But Rebecca was describing them from the emotional position she occupied at the time. She was telling her mother what the marriage felt like to her, not necessarily everything that had happened before those feelings appeared. That distinction would eventually become the difference between a family trying to help and a family choosing a side. Daniel knew Rebecca talked to Linda, but he didn't understand how much information was being shared. He assumed that whatever happened between them remained private. He was wrong. One evening, after another argument about money, Rebecca called Linda and cried. She told her mother that she didn't know how much longer she could continue living that way. Linda asked what Daniel had done. Rebecca explained the argument, but she also added years of frustrations that had accumulated inside her. Linda heard a daughter asking for help. Mark later heard the same story from his mother. By the time the information moved through the family, the details had become more certain than they had originally been. Daniel was no longer simply a husband struggling with financial problems and communication. In their minds, he was becoming a man who did not care about his wife, a man who could not be trusted, a man who was holding Rebecca back. Daniel knew none of this. He only noticed that Linda stopped calling. Mark became distant. Family invitations disappeared. When Daniel asked Rebecca what was happening, she told him she was tired of explaining herself. Daniel asked, "What are you telling them about me?" Rebecca became defensive. "I'm allowed to talk to my family." Daniel agreed. Then he asked, "But are you telling them everything?" Rebecca went silent. That silence was the first moment Daniel understood that the problem had moved beyond his marriage. He was no longer simply trying to repair things with Rebecca. He was now living inside a story about himself that other people had already accepted as fact. Mark eventually came to Daniel's home. Daniel expected a conversation, perhaps even an argument. Instead, Mark told him that Rebecca had suffered enough. Daniel asked what he meant. Mark said, "You know what you've done." Daniel replied that he didn't. Mark told him that the family had heard everything. Daniel asked, "Everything from who?" Mark said, "From Rebecca." Daniel looked at him and asked, "Did you ever ask me what happened?" Mark said nothing. Daniel understood the answer. Nobody had asked. They had listened to one side, believed it, and decided that asking questions would somehow be disloyal to Rebecca. The marriage continued for a little longer, but something had already changed. Rebecca's family was now present in almost every disagreement. Daniel could feel their opinions hanging over the relationship. If he suggested something, Rebecca would say her family disagreed. If he tried to defend himself, she would tell him that he was only making excuses. Daniel eventually suggested counseling. Rebecca initially agreed, but the appointment never happened. Instead, the arguments became more intense. One night, Daniel asked Rebecca a question he had been afraid to ask for months. He said, "If your family had never heard your version of our problems, would you still want to leave me?" Rebecca looked at him for a long time. Daniel waited for an answer. She didn't give him one. That silence told him something he didn't want to accept. The marriage was no longer being decided only between two people. When the divorce finally happened, there was no dramatic victory. Daniel didn't feel free. Rebecca didn't look happy. They simply looked exhausted. Years of memories had been reduced to paperwork and signatures. Daniel left the home with a few belongings and the painful understanding that the woman he had once promised to grow old with was now someone he needed to learn how to live without. The hardest part, however, was not losing Rebecca. It was losing her family. Linda refused to speak to him. Mark blocked his number. The family that had once welcomed him now treated him like a stranger. Daniel considered telling them his side. He wanted to explain the financial decisions. He wanted to show them the things Rebecca had left out. He wanted to tell them that he had made mistakes, but he had never been the man they believed him to be. Instead, he remained silent. He decided that defending himself to people who had already made up their minds would only create another battle. The first year after the divorce was painful. The second was quieter. By the third year, Daniel had rebuilt much of his life. He became more financially stable. He made new friends. He stopped checking whether Rebecca had contacted him. He stopped wondering whether her family had changed their minds. The silence that once felt unbearable eventually became normal. But while Daniel was rebuilding, Rebecca was beginning to question the story that had ended their marriage. It didn't happen all at once. It happened through small memories. She remembered Daniel trying to find additional work. She remembered him telling her that he was worried about their finances. She remembered him suggesting counseling. She remembered conversations with her mother when she had been angry and emotional. Most importantly, she began remembering the things she had not told her family, not because she had planned to deceive them, but because she had been too hurt to explain everything fairly. One afternoon, Rebecca asked Linda a question that changed the way her family viewed the past. She asked, "Did you ever talk to Daniel about what happened?" Linda replied, "You told us what happened." Rebecca answered, "I told you how I felt." Linda looked at her daughter. That distinction was painful. Rebecca was finally admitting that she had confused her feelings with facts. She had felt ignored, so she told them Daniel ignored her. She had felt frightened about their finances, so she told them Daniel was irresponsible. She had felt alone, so she told them she was alone in the marriage. None of those feelings were fake. But feelings are not always complete evidence of another person's intentions. Rebecca realized that she had wanted her family to validate her pain. She hadn't considered what would happen if they turned that validation into judgment. Mark was the next person to question what he believed. He remembered how quickly he had turned against Daniel. He remembered standing at Daniel's door and telling him to stay away from his sister. He remembered that he had never asked Daniel for his side. Then he found an old message Daniel had sent shortly before the divorce. It said, "I know you don't believe me, but I never wanted to hurt Rebecca. I hope one day she understands that." Mark read it several times. For the first time, he wondered whether he had mistaken loyalty for certainty. He had believed that protecting his sister meant believing everything she said. But perhaps protecting someone also meant helping them see clearly when emotions were making a difficult situation harder. Then the family discovered the financial information that Daniel had never managed to explain properly. Some of the decisions Rebecca had interpreted as selfish had actually been Daniel's attempt to protect the household from a deeper financial problem. He had made mistakes. He had failed to communicate. But he had not been secretly working against his family. The truth was more complicated than the story they had accepted. That discovery did not make Daniel perfect. It did something more important. It made the family realize that they had judged a complicated marriage using an incomplete story. Linda finally understood that she had been trying to protect her daughter, but in doing so, she had helped close every door through which Daniel could have explained himself. Rebecca eventually admitted the truth to her family. She told them she had been angry. She told them she had wanted someone to tell her that her feelings were justified. She admitted that she had shared private arguments when she was at her most emotional. She admitted that she had left out details that might have made Daniel look less responsible for the problems. And she admitted that when her family began treating Daniel as though he were entirely responsible for the marriage's collapse, she did not stop them. She had been too proud. She said, "I didn't plan to destroy our marriage, but I didn't realize how much damage my words were doing until it was too late." Linda cried when she heard this. Mark sat quietly. 5 years after helping push Daniel out of their lives, they finally understood that the story they had believed was incomplete. The family debated whether to contact Daniel. Rebecca was afraid he would refuse to see them. Mark thought they should leave him alone. Linda insisted that if they were truly sorry, they needed to face him. Eventually, they drove to Daniel's home. That was the evening that began with 3 knocks on his door. When Daniel opened it and saw them standing there, he immediately remembered the last time they had gathered around him. 5 years earlier, Mark had told him to leave Rebecca alone. Linda had looked at him with disappointment. Rebecca had stood nearby without correcting them. Now the same people were standing there with tears in their eyes. Linda said, "Daniel, we're not here to argue. We're here because we were wrong." Daniel didn't invite them inside immediately. He asked, "Why now?" Linda answered, "Because we finally understood that we never heard your side." Mark apologized next. He admitted that he had judged Daniel without asking questions. He said he had been so focused on protecting Rebecca that he had stopped seeing Daniel as a person. Then Rebecca spoke. Her voice was quiet. She told Daniel that she had told her family about her pain, but she had not told them everything. She said she had allowed her anger to shape the story. She admitted that when her family turned against him, she did not correct them. Daniel listened without interrupting. After 5 years, he was finally hearing the words he had once wished someone would say. But forgiveness was not automatic. Daniel told them that he had also made mistakes. He had shut down when Rebecca needed communication. He had tried to protect her from financial problems instead of including her in the decisions. He had allowed his pride to make him believe that carrying every burden alone was the same as being strong. But he also told them something he had never been able to say before. I needed someone to ask me what happened. Linda nodded. Daniel continued. You didn't have to believe me. You just had to listen. That sentence broke the tension in the room. Linda began crying. Mark apologized again. Rebecca looked at Daniel and said, I'm sorry. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He knew that 3 words could not return 5 years. They could not rebuild the marriage exactly as it had been. They could not erase the divorce. But they could become the beginning of something different. Daniel eventually forgave them, but he made one thing clear. Forgiveness would not mean pretending the past had never happened. It would not mean returning to the old marriage without addressing what had destroyed it. And it would not mean allowing other people to decide the truth of his life again. Rebecca understood. Linda understood. Mark understood. They had come expecting anger. Instead, they received honesty. Daniel told them that he had spent years being angry because he felt that nobody had ever heard him. But eventually he realized that carrying anger did not punish the people who had hurt him. It only kept him connected to the worst moment of his life. He said, I can't change what happened 5 years ago, but I can decide what I do with it now. That night did not restore Daniel and Rebecca's marriage. They did not suddenly become husband and wife again. Their lives had moved in different directions. But something more realistic happened. The truth was finally acknowledged. Rebecca accepted responsibility for her part. Linda and Mark accepted theirs. Daniel accepted his own mistakes without accepting blame for things he had not done. And for the first time, everyone stopped trying to decide who was the villain. They began asking a more important question. How did 2 people who once loved each other allow so much pain to become more powerful than their love? The answer was uncomfortable because it was not one single mistake. It was a chain of small decisions. Rebecca talked while she was angry. Her family listened while they were protective. Daniel withdrew when he should have communicated. Nobody paused long enough to understand the other side. A private marital problem became a family discussion. The family discussion became a judgment. The judgment became a permanent decision. And by the time everyone realized how complicated the truth really was, the marriage was already gone. That is how families can sometimes lose something precious without anyone intending to destroy it. Daniel's story leaves behind a difficult lesson. When someone you love tells you that their spouse has hurt them, their pain deserves to be taken seriously. But taking someone's pain seriously does not require you to immediately decide that the other person is guilty of everything they have been accused of. Sometimes the best support is not saying, you're right. Sometimes it is saying, I believe that you're hurting. Now let's understand what happened. That simple difference can prevent years of regret. 5 years earlier, Rebecca's family believed they were saving her. 5 years later, they stood at Daniel's door admitting that they had helped destroy something they never completely understood. They could not recover the lost years. They could not rewrite the divorce. But they could choose not to let another 5 years pass without telling the truth. Daniel could have slammed the door. He could have reminded them of every insult. He could have told them that they deserved the same silence they had given him. Instead, he listened, not because what they had done was acceptable, but because he no longer wanted anger to decide who he would become. And perhaps that is where this story truly ends. Not with Daniel getting revenge. Not with Rebecca being punished. Not with the family returning to the way things were. It ends with 4 people finally understanding that a marriage can be damaged by more than the 2 people inside it. Words matter. Assumptions matter. Pride matters. The people we trust with our pain can influence decisions that cannot easily be reversed. And when we tell our side of a story, especially when we are hurt, we should remember that the person we are describing may never get the opportunity to correct what others believe about them. So if you were Daniel, standing at that door 5 years later, would you have opened it? Would you have allowed Linda, Mark, and Rebecca to explain themselves? Would you have forgiven them after everything that happened? And if you were Rebecca, Would you have told your family the entire story when the marriage was falling apart, including the parts that made you uncomfortable? There are no easy answers. But perhaps that is why stories like Daniel's matter. Because somewhere, right now, someone is telling their family only one side of a painful situation. Somewhere, another person is being judged without being heard. And somewhere, a family may be making a decision that will take years to undo. If this story made you think about someone you have lost because of pride, misunderstanding, family pressure, or words spoken during anger, tell us where you're watching from and what you would have done if you were Daniel. And if you believe that families should listen before they judge, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our upcoming stories about betrayal, family conflict, regret, forgiveness, and the choices that can change a person's life forever. Because sometimes the person we think we know best is the person whose side of the story we never stop to hear.